many people are making the claim that Ibn Taymiyyah and the Athadis or the Hanbalis or the so-called traditionalists are anti-reason, they're anti-logic, they're totally against rational and philosophical argumentation, and therefore they cannot use any arguments for the existence of God, and Ibn Taymiyyah doesn't permit it in any condition or under any circumstances whatsoever. And that's completely wrong. And today we have an interesting episode, or at least interesting for me, and I hope for some of you guys out there. Now, this video is going to be on the question of whether or not Ibn Taymiyyah, Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah, a theologian from the Islamic tradition, he was also a Hanbali jurist, whether or not he permitted for rational argumentation in modern day, let's say, in the aspect of dawah, are we able to give rational arguments or so-called philosophical arguments? Wow, that's a buzzword. Some people are like, no, of course not, Jake. What are you talking about as a Athadi Salafi? Of course not, right? So we're going to be investigating that. Did Ibn Taymiyyah allow for philosophical or rational argumentation to establish God's existence? Meaning, can we believe in God's existence on the basis of rational argumentation? When you're speaking to an atheist, can you try to give him a rational proof to prove the existence of God? Did Ibn Taymiyyah permit that? Did he say that it was allowed? Did he write about it himself? Or maybe he didn't even speak about it at all. So those are questions that we're going to investigate. But what I want to first do is I want to play two videos, which are from Brother Paul's channel, Blogging Theology channel, which I've appeared on in the past a few times. And they were two long presentations that Brother Jamie Turner did, and another brother also did, which I'm going to show in just a second. And they did their presentations on Ibn Taymiyyah's epistemology, and more broadly on skepticism, how to deal with skeptics or so-called modern atheist skeptics today, and what would be Ibn Taymiyyah's point of view and dealing with them, and so on and so forth. So their videos were pretty long, about maybe, 6 hours combined, but I put together some clips from them that I want to say, first of all, at the outset, I think that they were both brilliant presentations. I think that the brothers did a very good job in many perspectives, right? I think, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward them for the efforts that they put in. With all that being said, there are a couple things that I want to highlight that were maybe at the very least not that clear in the presentation, and that I would like to clear up, because many times people who have an affinity towards Ibn Taymiyyah and his theology, and more broadly the Salafi or Athadi Aqidah or theology, are accused of being anti-rationalists or against reason or against logic or against the ability to use rational argumentation and to use proofs when speaking to an atheist who demands them to use rational proofs for the existence of God. We're accused of that many times. I don't actually, for people who are familiar with my channel, I don't think that that's true, and I'm going to attempt to demonstrate that from Ibn Taymiyyah himself. But before I do that, I want to play a couple clips that may give the impression to a listener who doesn't know that much, who doesn't have the full context, that that's what these two brothers are saying. Now, I know Jamie Turner personally. I know that that's not actually his view, and I'm actually going to show that that's not his view. But some people could get the wrong impression watching these very long clips, if they're not paying careful enough attention, that maybe this is what these brothers who are presenting Ibn Taymiyyah's epistemology and ideas, they may be thinking that that's what they're saying Ibn Taymiyyah's position actually is. And the reason I know that is because I've received not only one, but several messages from people who have watched these videos and said, well, Jake, you've said otherwise, so are they right? Can you explain this to us? Why are they saying this? I have to explain to them, well, I don't think that's really what they're saying. And so anyway, I want to break down some of these clips that some people may be confused by, but what I don't think that these brothers were actually trying to say or convey. and then I'll explain Ibn Taymiyyah's position from some of his texts and from Sheikh Hatem al-Hajj as well. So anyway, let's take a look.
So, this other kind of misconception that I sometimes encounter is, well, if you're against philosophical proofs for God, that means you are against rationality in general, which is, of course, a logical fallacy, which is a non sequitur fallacy. But what it shows is that many people have been accustomed to think that rationality equals syllogistic reasoning, that all of rationality is just deductive argumentation.
So I want to point out here that he's bringing up the objection that an objector might come to bring to him, and this is Dr. Nazir Khan, who again, I think he had a very good presentation, but this point particularly was interesting, where on his slide, he's presenting the objector as saying, if you're against philosophical proofs for God, that means you are against rationality. And his response is, no, you're not necessarily against rationality just because you're against so-called philosophical proofs for God, because that's not all of what encompasses rationality. Rationality is not limited to philosophical proofs for God, so it's a non sequitur. It doesn't actually follow. It's a non-starter. And this is correct to point out, but more fundamentally, if you are someone who wants to convey to people that Ibn Taymiyyah and more broadly the other people you mentioned in the video are not against philosophical proofs for God necessarily, then simply, I think the most fundamental response would be, well, you're claiming that we're against philosophical proofs for God in all situations, and that there are no situations in which we allow for them. Well, that's not true. So let me correct you on that and explain that that's wrong. And therefore, you can't claim that we are against rationality because we're not necessarily against philosophical proofs for God. But this brother doesn't actually do this on this slide. And so therefore, people are wondering, well, why would you even give in to the objector? You should be more fundamentally responding and saying, we're not actually against philosophical proofs for God. So you can't claim that we're against rationality, even based on your wacky claim here. So anyway, that's one point that I wanted to note. Now, again, I don't think that that's necessarily what the brother Dr. Nazir Khan was trying to convey, but nevertheless, that's the way it could come across to somebody who's listening. Well, why didn't you, if you do allow for philosophical proofs for God in certain situations, why didn't you respond and say it's not true that we're necessarily always against them? So that could convey the wrong message to somebody.
A number of Salafis I have met.
And so now here's Brother Paul talking about Salafis that he met seem to be completely against philosophy or against reasoning or whatever. And then we'll go from there.
A number of Salafis I have met, as I don't think it's intrinsic to that position, but their absolute rejection of philosophy is ironic, given that Ibn Taymiyyah did actually say that it was permissible to use it on certain occasions. And just as you have said, when the person being spoken to will only understand the answer in those terms, and it won't be open to any other kind of persuasion. So it is actually permissible by Ibn Taymiyyah himself.
Yeah, so we have to clarify, he mentions it can be used as a conversational tool, but he clarifies that even when it's used in that way, it does not, the epistemic justification for belief in God is not based on that. It's just a conversational tool. And that's where I think people, get into a source of confusion. Even scholars who
Brother Paul pointed out that there are some Salafis that he's met that seem to be completely against reasoning or philosophical arguments, and even for proofs for God and so on and so forth. And he said he finds it very interesting because from his reading, Ibn Taymiyyah did allow for that and did engage in it himself under certain conditions. And now I think that that's right. And I think Brother Paul was bringing this point up because, and I don't want to impute intention or motive onto him, but it seemed to me because Dr. Nazir Khan made it seem like that wasn't the case at points, or at least he saw that people may be confused to thinking that by listening to what he had to say up until that point. So he wanted to bring that in. But then Dr. Nazir's response, which I don't think was actually correct, I think was just incorrect, if I can say that to be blunt about it, was that he said, well, Ibn Taymiyyah did allow it in certain situations, but he was very clear that this is just a tool, and it doesn't actually confer knowledge or justification for the belief in God. But that's not true at all. I mean, Ibn Taymiyyah certainly believes that there are rational proofs for the existence of God, that a person can believe in God and be justified in believing in God based on those rational proofs. I mean, you know, and we'll see that in just a minute. But yeah, that seemed to me to be just a mistake, an incorrect statement there by Dr. Nazir Khan. Let's listen to it again, specifically this part here.
Even when it's used in that way, it does not, the epistemic justification for belief in God is not based on that. It's just a conversational tool. And that's where I think.
So he says it's just a conversational tool. No, it's not merely a conversational tool. He believes that it actually can reawaken somebody's fitrah, for example, that it actually can be justified to believe in God based on certain rational proofs. Not to say that you must have these rational proofs in order to be justified, but that they themselves you can be justified in believing in God based on certain rational proofs. Not that it's necessary, but that it's possible, and that some people it may even be necessary for people whose fitrah who has become clouded, or people who have been become obsessed with kalam, or so on and so forth. It may be necessary to present to them rational proofs, and it's not just a conversational tool.
Even scholars who took the approach of kalam, of arguing using philosophical proofs, they did recognize that sound fitrah is a way to testify to the existence of Allah. I will mention that there are some who denied that. There is an exception, but broadly speaking, many of those who took that approach still testified that the fitrah is a means of believing in God's existence. So
there he said many people, even many, and he was referring to the mutakallimin, or the so-called falasifa, or philosophers, those people who, he said, believed in using rational proofs to prove the existence of God. Even those who believed that, they also believed that the fitrah was a valid way of justifying your belief in God. And that is true, and he said not all of them, but many of them did, and that is true to a certain extent. But the way he made it seem there, and in other parts, if you just watch these clips here, it makes it seem as if it's sort of a dichotomy. He's contrasting those who believe in rational proofs for the existence of God, and Ibn Taymiyyah on the other hand, or the people who represent the epistemology that he wants to represent in the video, versus those who allow for rational proofs for the existence of God. But again, that's not the case. Ibn Taymiyyah did allow for that. So again, I'm not necessarily saying that that was his intention, but it could come across that way to a listener who hasn't studied these issues as much, and may not be able to see or investigate precisely what he's saying at these in these clips.
Justified that the fitrah is a means of believing in God's existence. So that answers this fundamental misconception that people have, that belief in God is something that is nadari, or inferential, rather than daruri. It is axiomatic, right? And he points out that right from the very first verse in the Quran, we can see that belief in God is something that is axiomatic.
So there, he's saying, he's talking about Ibn Taymiyyah, and he's contrasting the belief in God being nadari, or being daruri, being something that is necessary or axiomatic, versus nadari, or something that is inferential, right? That it comes via some inferential reasoning process. And again, yeah, those are not necessarily the same, but to contrast them in that way, and to paint Ibn Taymiyyah as if he's saying that it is daruri, or axiomatic, which of course I believe in as well. But it's almost as if you put it with those other two clips, as if he's saying he only believes it's possible to confer knowledge or be justified in believing in God based on a fitri perspective, and not necessarily another perspective, or to believe in God or be justified in believing in God through an inferential reasoning process, which Ibn Taymiyyah explicitly uses that same wording, and you'll see it in the quote in just a moment when I go over Ibn Taymiyyah's perspective, that he believes it's possible through both. I'm going to move to another presentation here by Brother Jamie Turner, which he is attempting to explain Ibn Taymiyyah's religious epistemology, and I'll go through some of these clips. Let's take a look.
Now, the final view here, Reformed epistemology, is different, particularly from theistic evidentialism, because instead of attacking premise 2 by saying that we've got good arguments that God exists, Reformed epistemologists deny premise 1, and they say, actually, somebody can know that God exists, even if they don't have a good argument for God's existence. So the Reformed epistemologist attacks premise 1, and the theistic evidentialist typically attacks premise 2, and the fideist might just say, well, this whole argument just puts us on the wrong plane when it comes to thinking about God. Reformed epistemology seems to me to be the view that aligns best with Ibn Taymiyyah's own view of religious epistemology.
Yeah, so basically, the Reformed epistemologist could also...
So Jamie Turner is saying that he believes that Ibn Taymiyyah's view is best explained in a modern vocabulary as being a Reformed epistemology. And he's explaining the difference between theistic evidentialism, fideism, and Reformed epistemology. And the difference he's seeing between theistic evidentialism and Reformed epistemology is that of these three premises here, the theistic evidentialist attacks premise 2, that there is no good argument for theistic belief or the existence of God. And so theistic evidentialists will provide rational arguments for the existence of God because they do believe that there are good arguments for the existence of God, rational arguments. Whereas he believes instead, as a Reformed epistemologist, Ibn Taymiyyah would attack premise 1, that a person knows that P is true, meaning a person knows that God exists if and only if it is based on a good argument. So you're basically only justified in your belief in God if you have a rational argument for the belief in God. So that's the distinction that he's making. But what Brother Bassam will now point out, because I think he's trying to steer Jamie in the right direction, and not that Jamie doesn't know this, but for him to bring it up at this time, is that, well, couldn't somebody who believes that you don't necessarily need a rational argument to be justified in belief in God also believe that there are good arguments? Meaning, it's not necessary that you have a rational argument to be justified in the belief in God. Somebody can believe in that while at the same time also believing that there are good rational arguments, that they're not necessary, but nevertheless they still exist for those who do need them, who might need them or might require them. So you'll see Brother Bassam say that.
Believe, but he could also attack premise 2 in addition to premise 1. Like he could also believe, no, look, there are really good arguments for God's existence. However, the point I want to stress is that they are not necessarily required for a justification in believing in God. While the theistic evidentialist would say, no, actually they are required, and that's why we insist that they're there. So, the Reformed epistemologist could agree with the theistic evidentialist that, of course, there are good arguments for God's existence, but we part ways when we say that they are necessary for having a justified belief in God. Would that be an accurate summary?
Yeah, absolutely. And I also think the Reformed epistemologist might say, and we'll maybe touch on this right towards the end of the presentation, that theistic arguments for God's existence, they are not necessary, and they might not even be sufficient. They're not sufficient to know God. In other words, the arguments for God's existence, they raise the probability that God exists quite well, but they're not sufficient for knowledge. Because as per our introduction to knowledge requires that it's that our beliefs produced by a kind of skill that sort of guarantees that belief hits the target of truth. If it only probabilizes it, then that's not going to get you knowledge as well. So that's something to bear in mind. And finally, about that.
So there, in response to Brother Bassam, he's saying, well, yeah, there could be some Reformed epistemologists that agree that there are good rational arguments that provide justification for the belief in God, but then he responds or gives the impression of it as if he doesn't actually believe in that he doesn't actually believe that there are any good rational arguments for the existence of God, or that there may be, but it doesn't provide justification for knowledge. It doesn't reach the bar of knowledge because they're merely probabilistic, or don't reach the bar of certainty, or the bar that is required to get to be justified and have knowledge.
And the problem with that is, if the arguments are not sufficient to give knowledge of God, which I don't think they are, when you think about what knowledge entails, the stringent requirement of knowledge. So that's going to be a problem, because we're going to say that the the kind of arguments that the ordinary believer is going to have, they're not sufficient to confer knowledge on that believer, in my view. So you're basically, it's akin to saying they don't know God.
Yes.
We depend on arguments alone.
So there, again, it seems like Brother Jamie is saying, well, the rational arguments alone won't be able to confer knowledge. They won't meet the bar of proper justification for belief and for knowledge. And there's some ambiguity. It seems like, well, maybe he means the arguments of the, common person, but not necessarily all rational arguments in general. So maybe that's what he means to say, but it's not really all that clear, especially in that context.
We will not have knowledge, is my view. So that would be the equivalent of saying that the ordinary believer just doesn't know Allah. And that seems counterintuitive.
So then again, he says if we relied just on rational arguments, then we wouldn't be able to have justification or knowledge in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that would mean that the common person just wouldn't be justified in believing in God. So again, maybe he just means the common person, but not necessarily all rational arguments. But it's not entirely clear, especially in light of the other clips and what he had to say in the rest of the presentation. Bassam asks a question, I think, at the very end of the presentation during the conclusion, and I didn't ask him about this directly, I don't think. I think he asked this question to Jamie to get him to say what he thinks Jamie will say, because by the end of the conversation, it may not be clear to the audience, and that's why he wants Jamie to say what he's going to say here, which is definitely correct and is going to lead into what I show you guys from Ibn Taymiyyah himself.
Did Ibn Taymiyyah recognize that an evidentialist approach might be required for certain people who just can't help themselves and they demand philosophical arguments as evidence? Like they're too sucked into the philosophical discourse, and they can't help but demand these arguments, and they're simply not convinced with this approach. Like, did he recognize that, okay, for some people, the evidentialist approach is probably required? I mean, did he comment on this, or?
Yeah, definitely. He commented on a few things related to this, I think, and both of them, from my mind, come from his Kitab al-Mantiqiyin. Now, he has this idea that, yes, somebody who's delved into Quran and engaged with that for some period, they've kind of attuned themselves and adjusted themselves to that kind of discourse, such that, just pointing out that their experience might be sufficient for them won't satisfy them, maybe, even at the epistemic level. And so they might actually need arguments because they've been attuned and adjusted to that kind of way of thinking about God. The other thing is, he actually says explicitly, I have this quote in various places from his Majmu' al-Fatawa, that somebody whose fitrah is corrupt in some sense, impaired in some sense, may need an argument to revitalize it again. So that's another kind of person. The other thing that Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah says is that basically that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made evidence of him like widespread in different ways, so that there isn't necessarily one route, if you get me. And he suggests like somebody through like in this fitri daruri kind of way they can know. He suggests through like ilham, or kind of really spiritual experience, even through taqleed of a reliable person, even through nadar, so that there are a combination of ways. And his problem with the mutakallim is that they've restricted the root or source to knowledge of God to just arguments. Ibn Taymiyyah wants to open it.
So yeah, that's perfect. That's exactly what he's saying there, and that's at the very end, which he wouldn't have said in those clear of terms unless Brother Bassam asked the question. Now, I know that Jamie believes it because he clearly said it at the end, and I've spoken to him about this. And, I'm just playing these clips to show that I think in both cases, both brothers believe what Jamie said at the end, but it doesn't always come out so clearly in the presentation, especially when it's long, 2, 3, 4 hours or whatever it is. And largely because they're trying to focus on something else. They're trying to focus on the fact that we can be justified in God and in belief in God apart from a rational argument, meaning that it's not necessary to have a rational argument. And fair enough, but when you only focus on that and you don't really clearly mention that although you can be justified without the rational argument, doesn't mean that Ibn Taymiyyah didn't permit rational arguments in certain cases. And Jamie brought up a few examples. One, he said, is like for somebody who's obsessed with kalam or obsessed with these so-called, very detailed arguments with many premises and so on. So for somebody who's obsessed with that, it may be required even. It may be even required to give somebody an argument in that form if you have the ability to do so. Also, for the person whose fitrah has become clouded or distorted over time, such that they may require a rational argument in order to remove those clouds or cobwebs, so to speak, from the fitrah to reinvigorate it. The third point he mentioned there was that Ibn Taymiyyah also mentions there are several different ways to have the belief in God. It could be fitri, it could be from a rational argument, it could be from ilham or making taqlid of a reliable person, and so on and so forth. And that Ibn Taymiyyah's argument primarily with the mutakallimun was that they restricted justification of belief in God purely to the rational discursive reasoning process and a sort of philosophical argumentation, which he believed that was one pathway of justification or having knowledge of God, but not necessary and not the only one that somebody could be justified in belief in God. So that was a perfect summary, but came very much at the end of a 3-hour presentation. Now I know, because I spoke to Brother Jamie, that of course he believes in that and knew that from Ibn Taymiyyah. It's not like Bassam whispered in his ear or anything, but he was clearly focused on something else in the other presentation, which I understand, but I think at the same time, if he just would have said that on his own, that one statement either at the beginning or in the middle when discussing this, or maybe, one or two times throughout the presentation, it would have been clear and sufficient to the audience. But again, what I'm cautioning us when we speak about these things is that we have to be cognizant of the fact that many people are making the claim that Ibn Taymiyyah and the Athadis or the Hanbalis or the so-called traditionalists are anti-reason, they're anti-logic, they're totally against rational and philosophical argumentation, and therefore they cannot use any arguments for the existence of God, and Ibn Taymiyyah doesn't permit it in any condition or under any circumstances whatsoever. And that's completely wrong, and that's why we have to be careful that when we talk about these things, it doesn't come across in any way as if we are saying that, right? And I know that it wasn't Dr. Nazir Khan's intention of doing that, nor Brother Jamie Turner. But nevertheless, I thought that it needed some clarification. Now, here, what I want to do is I want to read a couple quotes here, which should be placed on the screen from Ibn Taymiyyah himself regarding this issue. So he says, affirming and acknowledging the Creator is natural and necessary in people's souls, even though some people's fitrah may become corrupted to the extent that they need discursive reasoning to attain recognition. Meaning, some people, and this is the point that Jamie Turner mentioned, which is correct, some people's fitrah may become so corrupted that they need a discursive reasoning or inferential reasoning argumentation in order to attain recognition of God or belief in God. This is the view of the majority of people and the wise observers, that recognition is sometimes achieved through necessity, meaning axiomatic, or through a daruri path, right? And sometimes through nadhr, right? Through discursive reasoning process, or inferential reasoning process. So that's one quote from Ibn Taymiyyah. The second quote is, some people find that the lengthier and more obscure the premises are, and this is another point that Jamie Turner mentioned, and the more convoluted the argument is, the more beneficial it is for them. And we're not saying that this is the way that it should be, but it's reality for some people, because their minds have become accustomed to examining obscure matters. If the evidence is straightforward or its premises are few and clear, their minds do not delight in it. And with such individuals, dialectical and logical methods might be used because they suit their habits. So in both cases, he allows for that to happen, right? And these translations were provided by Sheikh Hatem al-Hajj, so shout out to him, just mentioning that. Now, here is a quote directly again from Ibn Taymiyyah. Now, we spoke generally, but here's an example of him mentioning arguments for the existence of God. So this is from Ibn Taymiyyah. And among the ways of explaining the vastness of the arguments for the Maker's existence is to say the classification of existence into the two categories of necessary and contingent. So basically, the contingency argument. And the subsequent inference of the necessary existence from the contingent existence. This is merely one of the methods of demonstration from a vast genre of arguments that allows for other more evident methods of demonstration, meaning that's one way, the contingency argument, or basically inferring the necessary existence from contingent existence. That's one way to prove the existence of the Creator. Another one, which he sees as a better way of classifying things, is to classify things under what is originated, which has, or what has a beginning in time, and that which is eternal, and subsequently inferring the eternal existent from what is originated, right? So that's his preferred classification or way of doing that. Now, here is a quote from Hatem al-Hajj's text, which I've recommended several times for English readers on Athari Aqidah or Creed. And this is from page 85. He says this about Ibn Taymiyyah's cosmological argument. Ibn Taymiyyah provides a simpler explanation of the cosmological argument that rests on three pillars: the existence of extant beings that are obviously temporal. So again, showing that his preferred method is to talk about beings or things that exist which have a beginning in time, things that are hadith, and then inferring from that there must be eternal creator. So he says the existence of extant beings that are obviously temporal, like ourselves, for example, and that are incapable of creating themselves or of creation themselves. This points to a creator. The creator must be an uncaused cause, eternal and self-sufficient, otherwise we fall into infinite regress. Also, the possible/contingent creations that are mumkin need a preponderator who is necessary, wajib al-wujud, to come to existence. And since the mumkin is existent and the necessary is a priori existent. So again, he's very clearly saying in certain circumstances, Ibn Taymiyyah allowed for rational argumentation. He himself believed in it, and not merely as a tool, but actually as a proof for God's existence, and he could be justified in these arguments, and gave a couple examples, and are the same examples based on the primary source text that I read from Ibn Taymiyyah about the vastness of arguments, but the preferred method is to infer from the originated or temporal existent the eternal existent, and that's the creator himself. And even uses terms like wajib al-wujud, or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being the necessary being, and so on and so forth. Okay, if that weren't enough, the last thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to show you guys from John Hoover, the Ibn Taymiyyah argument that I was quite critical of in certain points in an earlier video. But nevertheless, John Hoover gets this point right in section 4.2, Reason and Revelation. He says this: it is also Ibn Taymiyyah's conviction that much of what is known about God through revelation is known equally and primarily from reason and the human natural constitution, fitra, meaning that what is known about God is not restricted to revelation. It can be known through the fitrah and through the aql, through reason. Prophets complete and perfect what humans already know, and revelation reiterates rational proofs relevant to religion and exposes incorrect reasoning for what it is. There is therefore no conflict between true revelation and correct reason. And this is the main claim to which Ibn Taymiyyah devotes his masterwork, averting the conflict between reason and revelation. Ibn Taymiyyah condemns philosophers and post-classical Kalam theologians like the Ash'ari Fakhr al-Din Arazi for demoting the Quran to mere information and subjecting it to alien and erroneous regimes of reason that lead to stripping God of his rightful attributes. So the problem is not with reason. The problem is with claiming certain rational principles which both contradict reason, the fitrah, and the naql, and scripture, right? And which result in stripping of God from his attributes. Ibn Taymiyyah's apologetic aim is to take the rational high ground away from the philosophers and Kalam theologians by showing that his theology is what both reason and the text of Revelation indicate. So this is why the Mutakallimun hated Ibn Taymiyyah so much, many of them, more so than a figure like Ibn Qudama. Why? Because even though Ibn Qudama was at times very harsh against the Ash'aris and didn't agree with their aqidah or theology, he mainly refuted them from a scriptural or traditional point of view, whereas Ibn Taymiyyah went into Kalam, refuted the Mutakallimun, played their own game, so to speak, and refuted them from a rational perspective as well as from a Naqli perspective. He refuted them from both angles. And that's why in some circles amongst the Mutakallimun and modern figures, without mentioning names, they're very critical of Ibn Taymiyyah as opposed to other Athari, right? Because he sort of beat them at their own game. What follows here and in the following subsections will focus more on clarifying Ibn Taymiyyah's theological concepts than on their textual indicants. We begin with the basics of his natural theology. So does he believe in natural theology? Obviously, that's what John Hoover is saying. As noted above, Ibn Taymiyyah affirms that everything originated requires a cause for its existence, and creatures thereby know immediately that God exists by virtue of their need for a creator. There is no need for the prolix reasoning of the Kalam cosmological argument for the existence of God from atoms and accidents. So Ibn Taymiyyah doesn't necessarily reject the cosmological argument, nor does he reject the contingency argument. He just rejects the contingency argument of what Ibn Sina is putting forward in terms of concluding in this existent God that is really just almost nothingness, right? This divine simplicity conception of God, and also a rejection of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala acting in succession, which results from the argument of the Mutakallimun. So, and some people may be saying, well, wait, Jake, isn't this hypocritical? You're appealing to John Hoover when you were critical of him? No, because as I said, John Hoover's job is difficult, and sometimes he gets things right in accurately representing Ibn Taymiyyah, and other times he doesn't. I just wanted to show that a more traditional scholar like Sheikh Hatem al-Hajj says this, as well as even some Western academics like John Hoover. With that being said, guys, I hope this clarifies Ibn Taymiyyah's position on reason and revelation and whether or not he permits use of rational argumentation in dawah with atheists. Yes, he does when the da'i or the person who's giving dawah sees that it's necessary for a variety of reasons. Maybe the person is obsessed with these type of arguments, in which case may be a good thing to use it if you're capable. And in other situations in which a person's fitrah has been so corrupted that it may shed light and remove the clouds and the cobwebs from the person's fitrah and allow him to properly recognize God. So Ibn Taymiyyah is not somebody against reason. He's not someone against rational argumentation. In fact, sometimes he sees it's necessary under certain conditions. Again, I just want to reiterate, brilliant presentations from Brother Jamie and the other brother. I think they did brilliant jobs. Nevertheless, I think that there could be a bit more clarity on the points that I mentioned and highlighting them, because detractors from the Athari creed will try to bring these points up and say, see, yeah, look, Ibn Taymiyyah is anti-reason, and therefore some additional clarity sometimes is necessary. With that being said, guys, I want to thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed this video and found it educational, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the notification bell so you get notified of future videos. Also, please consider commenting and liking this video if you want to share your thoughts. I would greatly appreciate that. Share this video as well if you want it to reach more people with your on your social media platforms or with your friends and family. No matter how big or small your reach is, it really does help, guys. And if you want to go above and beyond and support my channel, then the best way to do so is to donate at the GoFundMe link, which is pinned at the top of the description of this video, as well as my other videos. With that being said, guys, until next time, inshallah, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.